We start a new series called Great Women Writers, which is sponsored by the Connolly Foundation and the members of the Art Alliance. And tonight we welcome Dr. Peter Kahn, who will speak on Pearl S. Buck. And after his lecture, Dr. Kahn will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And following that, Dr. Kahn will be signing copies of his new book right across the hallway here, Pearl S. Buck, A Cultural Biography. And the Joseph Fox bookstore is making copies available to those of you who wish to purchase it. So now, please welcome Dr. Peter Kahn.
Thank you. I'm organizing myself because this is on television, as I hope most of you understand, and so I'm going to attempt to look even more intelligent, whatever that level is, than I might otherwise have, and sometimes it's a stretch. Anyway, let me start with a story and a disclaimer. A couple of weeks ago, I did a talk on this book at a little bookstore in Baltimore, and sitting in the front row was a teenager, and she had quite a lot of hair, and she had jewelry attached to her in different places, and she didn't look very happy. And after a while, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I simply said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "When is Pearl Buck showing up?" she had to read that book for class, and she had to do a paper, and she saw the sign, "Meet the author." And she drew what I guess is a perfectly reasonable inference from that, and she was and so I said, "Later," because I didn't want her to just flounce out. I mean, she's the late Pearl Buck, so I thought that wasn't too much of a... what I'm going to do is I'm certainly not going to read. In fact, I'm going to occasionally pick the book up as a kind of a threat, which is say if things aren't going well, I'll start to read, but that seems to me to be the wrong thing to do. I'm going to talk for, maybe 30 minutes and attempt to do so in a reasonably coherent way. I don't have a text. You'll be, I hope, relieved to notice. I'm going to divide this little talk up into essentially three parts. I'm going to talk about Pearl Buck a little bit, biographically and so on, some of the high points of her life. Then I'm going to talk, perhaps even more briefly, about what happened to her in the last 20 or 30 years and maybe why. And then most briefly, I'm going to talk about my own connection to the project, my own involvement in this project. And then what I'd really like to do, in fact, if they would let me get away with it, we would start with it now, is what they call questions and answers, because in fact that's a lot more fun than having me simply talk. I mean, instead of me simply talking, we could all buy the book, which would be, this is what I'm hoping a lot of you will do. But I do want to talk a little bit about her life, in part because it'll set the stage for the conversation, and because not everybody is as familiar as everybody else with this life, especially now in 1997. And because it was an extraordinary life, and it's worth recalling even briefly. It divides rather conveniently into two halves. Pearl Buck was born in 1892, just over a century ago, and although she is often described as having been born in China, she was in fact born in West Virginia when her parents were home on a home leave from China. Pearl Buck's parents were Southern Presbyterian missionaries who had gone to China in 1880, a dozen years before Pearl Buck's birth. And her father, who was an unreconstructed and unreconstructible and unapologetic fundamentalist, conservative Southern Presbyterian evangelical missionary, was magnificently named Reverend Absalom Seidenstricker. Pearl Buck loved Dickens, and if Dickens had to do a book with a Southern Presbyterian, unreconstructed fundamentalist minister, he couldn't have done better than Absalom Seidenstricker. And Pearl Buck's mother, an equally devout, though as I'll hope to illustrate in just a moment, a much more complicated character, Carrie Stoltings Seidenstricker, married in 1880 and immediately went off to China, where they spent the rest of their lives. And that meant that Pearl Buck's father spent the remaining 51 years of his 80-year life itinerating around rural China, especially Jiangxi and Anhui province, preaching the gospel to the people he called the heathens, who in his view were ripe for the harvest. It is estimated perhaps actually addressed face-to-face 1 million people in 50 years. Made a few converts. Most people were indifferent to the message. Prolbach's mother, on the other hand, while she initially shared the evangelical enthusiasm of her husband and was eager to join him in the China mission field, almost immediately changed her mind, as far as I can figure out. That is to say, they arrived in China in 1880, and while both would live the rest of their lives there, Pearl's mother, Carrie Stolting-Seidenstricker, would become immediately homesick and spend the 41 years that remained of her life wishing things had gone differently. She bore 7 children. 4 of them died in China. Indeed, one of the reasons Prolbach was born in West Virginia is that Pearl was, I guess, the 4th of the children to be born. 2 had already died in infancy in China, and Carrie Stolting insisted that this child was going to be born in the United States. For me, Prolbach's mother and father are almost, perhaps too neatly, symmetrically juxtaposed to each other as a way of explaining who Prolbach would become. She admired her father tremendously. She admired parts of her father's character and accomplishment tremendously. She admired his courage, his sheer tenacity, in a certain sense, the grandeur of his futility, his willingness to spend those 51 years itinerating around the Chinese countryside, preaching the gospel to people who weren't interested, has a kind of nobility to it. But she despised his dogmatism. She, I think fairly early on, simply abandoned his Christian commitment altogether. And above all, she was appalled by his misogyny. Absalom Seidenstricker was a man who simply didn't like women, didn't understand women, treated his wife badly, treated Pearl badly. He was a man about whom Pearl said later, if he had lived 300 years earlier, he would have burned witches. But she inherited from him a passion for scholarship. He was a great Chinese linguist, and she would grow up bilingual. As I know he was a very fine Chinese linguist. I don't just take that on faith, because he actually, among his many publications, published a little Chinese grammar for people learning the language. And when I was studying the language 5 years ago, I took this more than century-old Chinese grammar to my teacher as a way of making up for my wretched classroom performance, which was earning me F after F after F after F. And she took a look at this more than century-old Chinese grammar and says, not bad. It's not bad at all. It's a good piece of work, even now. From her mother, she inherited other characteristics. Her mother had a passion for family and for the centrality of family. Her mother seems to have been a deeply compassionate woman. While Absalom was preaching, Carrie was dispensing medicine, teaching people to read, gathering up clothing during times, and trying to gather up food during times of famine, hard times. And Prolbach inherited a good deal of that from her. On the other hand, Carrie Stolting-Seidenstricker stayed trapped in a marriage that from fairly early on she knew wasn't right. And Prolbach would never do that. She refused to imitate her mother's, in a certain sense, conventionally female habits of deference or self-sacrifice. She was going to be her own woman. So to put all this in a shorthand, the hypothesis that I explore in this book is that Prolbach inherited an evangelical vocation from her father, but turned it toward humanitarian purposes, and would become, as I'll hope to detail without becoming too clouded up with details in the next couple of minutes, would become a staggering philanthropist. I mean, a philanthropist on an amazing scale over the 80 years of her own life. Prolbach, like her father, lived to be 80. So she was born in West Virginia, went to China at 3 months old with those 2 parents of hers, and lived there most of the next 40 years. She lived the first half of her 80 years in China. She came back to the United States from time to time, most extensively for 4 years to go to college at a women's college in Virginia called Randolph-Macon Women's College. But she spent almost all of what could be called her childhood, her adolescence, her early adulthood, and indeed into early middle age in China. She was bilingual. She was able not only to speak a couple of dialects, but could read Chinese characters. And again, those of you that know something about the language know those are completely separate accomplishments. I got an F in the spoken part of my Chinese course and an F double minus in the written part of my Chinese course, because that's, as a Chinese friend of mine says, that language is so hard, even we can't do it, he says, you know, the written part of that language. When she finished college, when Pro Buck finished college in 1914, she really had intended to stay in the United States. She hadn't actually planned to go back to China. She didn't envision a career for herself as the woman who would, within about 15 years, write the book that would permanently change Western impressions of China. That hadn't crossed her mind. She, at the age of 21 or 22, graduating from college, simply thought of herself as a person who probably didn't have a place in China. She wasn't going to be a missionary. She was a single woman, and it wasn't at all clear that China was an attractive alternative. Indeed, she had made a commitment to stay in the States at Randolph-Macon Women's College and teach psychology. She'd been hired as a teaching assistant. But her mother had become gravely ill, and she was called back to China by her father, and indeed would have gone back, whether anybody had called her back or not, to nurse her mother in what would become her mother's final illness, though it would go on for several years. And shortly thereafter, she met a young man named John Lossing Buck, known as Lossing, from whom she got the name Buck, a name she always disliked, in part because she disliked the name, and in part because, as I will now reveal, she grew to dislike John Lossing Buck tremendously. They were married, and in 1917 through early 1920, for about 3 years, they moved out to the countryside, Anhui Province, a little town called Nanzhuzhuo. And that's an important place because that's the good earth. That's the place where the good earth is set. That's the real hard countryside, a place of poverty, a place that even today is in China known as the Appalachia of China, a place that is not on most maps and certainly not on any tourist itineraries. When my wife and I went out there, after 6 hours on the hard bench, 4th class Iron Rooster, and emerged from the train station a couple of years ago when we were in search of Pearl Buck, we were met by a 2-car convoy. The mayor was in one and the Communist Party secretary was in the other. This was a big deal. And I said, whoa, what is all this? And they said, you are the first Westerner ever to have asked to come here. And it was a tremendous celebration, actually. I was followed around for 2.5 days by a guy with a video camera. And I said, is that security? And they said, no, it's for the archive. So I have a third party took a photograph. There's a photograph of me taking a photograph of this guy taking a video of me walking around this little town in Anhui Province. But it was the formative place for Pearl Buck's career as a writer. And again, it isn't clear that she actually knew that at the time. But she was gathering the impressions and meeting the people and seeing the scenery that would later go into, in particular, that most important of all her books. Lossing Buck and Pearl then moved back to Nanking, as it was then called, Nanjing, in 1921, where she and he would live, though the marriage would deteriorate seriously for the next dozen or so years. And they had their only birth child. She had her only birth, or biological child, a daughter named Carol. And the birth of that child entailed a multiple tragedy for Pearl Buck. And I pause here simply because, for me, it's kind of the turning point in her entire adult life. First of all, the child would be diagnosed as seriously retarded and would spend her entire life inalterably retarded. Secondly, in the course of the birth, Pearl was discovered to have a uterine tumor and had a hysterectomy, so it would be the only birth child. And in part as a consequence of all this, although it had already been happening, the marriage, which was under strain, was put under greater strain and began simply to collapse. And so the 20s were a hard decade for Pearl Buck. Living in China at a time of increasing unrest. She'd gotten shot at on a couple of occasions when she was out in Anhui Province, and she would get shot at again in Nanking in 1927 in the Nanking incident. Anti-foreign sentiment was rising, and although she had lived there all her life and spoke the language, she still knew that she was an outsider. She wasn't Chinese, and she would hear that from time to time. Yang Guizi, foreign devil. Her hair was the wrong color, blonde. Her eyes were the wrong color, blue. Her skin was the wrong color. So it was a tough time. She was poor. The family was relatively poor. And she began to think more and more that she needed to have a life of her own and an income of her own, because she was going to take care of that child of hers, and she wasn't going to depend upon her husband to do it. She was already redrawing her life on different lines than her mother might have. In 1930, she published her first novel. She's now approaching 40 years old, keep that in mind. She published her first novel. It got fairly good notices and sold reasonably well. The name, which is almost not important, was East Wind, West Wind. In 1931, she published her second novel, and the rest is history. That novel was called The Good Earth, and it became the best-selling novel of 1931 and the best-selling novel of 1932, which is almost unprecedented. Sales figures, as any of you who have ever tried to do this research know, are notoriously hard to actually track down. People throw figures around, and they're actually very hard to get. But it's quite clear this book, to say that this book sold in the millions and has sold in the tens of millions over the last, 65 years, is accurate. Both in English editions and in foreign language editions. Pearl Buck's stuff has been translated into 70-plus languages. And indeed, in a study run by the United Nations, not too many years ago, she was judged to have had her books translated into more languages than any other 20th century American writer. More than Steinbeck, more than Jack London, more than Hemingway. It may not be true today, but it was true as recently as 1970. That book, and its astonishing success, both commercially and critically, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And despite anything you may have heard about Pearl Buck's literary reputation later, much of which is true, it was treated very nicely by the critics, by and large. In fact, it was treated rapturously by most critics. And she began to write, and write, and write. And I want to somehow or other put an underline on this. I said that Pearl Buck's life divided into two parts. She lived about 80 years, the first 40 in China, the second 40 in the United States. She was nearly 40 years old when she published her second novel, The Good Earth. By the time she died at the age of 80, she had published 80 books. So you do the arithmetic. It means that she was publishing at the rate of 2 books a year for 40 years. That's too many. And I'm sort of first in line to insist that it's probably 70 too many. On the other hand, as I've said in her defense from time to time, if that means there are 10 of her books that are worth looking at, that's not a bad lifetime's work. Most of us aren't going to do it. And I'm willing to name the 10 that I think are probably worth another look. With The Good Earth, with the more or less definitive ending of the marriage, with the death of her father, by the way, who died just at about the time of The Good Earth's publication, he was alive when it was published, so that he was able, when she gave him a copy as a gift, to thank her and tell her that he would not have time to read it, which was a kind of almost valedictory gesture of contempt. With the death of her father, with the publication of The Good Earth, with increasing violence and unrest in China. Remember, in 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and it was clear that it was only a question of time before the whole nation would be engulfed in war. At that point, Pearl Buck did move back to the United States and commenced this extraordinary second half of her life, this career of writing and of humanitarian and political activism on an incredible scale. I was thinking about how to put this in front of you. And I don't want to do it by a laundry list of organizations and accomplishments and medals and so on that she won. But I want to illustrate it with just a couple of examples. From almost the day she stepped off the boat in 1934, she became active in American civil rights. So active that by 1935, Roger Wilkins, then a young reporter for the Chicago Defender, could say, "She is the white woman on whom we most depend. She is the white person on whom we most depend." And several black critics saw The Good Earth itself as an important statement about issues of color. In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, when Pearl Buck was leading a campaign against the segregated armed forces and against discrimination in war industries, in 1942, Walter White, then the executive secretary of the NAACP, said at a Madison Square Garden rally to 50,000 people, "There's only 2 white Americans that understand what's going on in black America, and they're both women. One is Eleanor Roosevelt, and the other is Pearl Buck." In 1949, Pearl Buck co-authored a book on civil rights with Eslander Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife. The Robesons and Pearl Buck and her second husband, Richard Walsh, were good friends. From a couple of years after her move back to the United States, she was active in women's rights. and in the 1930s and 1940s was a very prominent supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment at a time when, as you may or may not know, virtually every organized women's group was opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. Pearl Buck, almost alone, together with the National Women's Party, was arguing vigorously on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment. In 1941, Pearl Buck published a book of her feminist essays called Of Men and Women. The New York Times said, "This is an important book. It's as important as Virginia Woolf's work in feminism." Virginia Woolf remained visible thereafter. Pearl Buck didn't. Throughout the Second World War, Pearl Buck was perhaps at the height of her influence and her fame. She had added the Nobel Prize to her Pulitzer Prize. She had won the Nobel in 1938, was the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And she used that celebrity of hers as a kind of a bully pulpit from which to argue the world into her view of simple decency and equal rights. She was associated fairly predictably with the Chinese throughout the Second World War in their opposition to Japanese aggression, and that was fair. Among other things, she led the campaign to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws, those notorious laws that go back to the 1880s. Pearl Buck took advantage of the politics of the war when Americans were allied with Republican China, and actually she was the president of the committee to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws, and they were repealed in 1943. At the same time, she was one of the few prominent Americans who, within a week of Franklin Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, which was Japanese-American internment, within a week, she was giving speeches attacking Japanese internment and writing to her friend Eleanor Roosevelt, denouncing the whole policy as anti-democratic and pleading with Eleanor to bring it to Franklin's attention. She was in those same years, by the way, the first president of the American League for Indian Independence. And one of the things Pearl Buck liked to do better than anything else was denounce Winston Churchill, whom she regarded as an antique reminder of Victorian imperialism. Finally, perhaps the thing for which she is to this day most well known, since much of the rest of her career, for reasons that we want to talk about, disappeared, the thing for which she remained well known was her work with children, and it's serious and significant and long-term work. Aside from adopting 7 children of her own, she also in 1949 established Welcome House, the world's first international interracial adoption agency. She did it working with James Michener and Oscar Hammerstein II. They were what Michener called a triumvirate. And then a few years later, in 1964, she established the Pearl Buck Foundation, which gathers money in the States and sends it overseas, particularly to children who are mixed race, Amerasian children in particular, who historically have had difficulty finding a home on either side of the Pacific. Asian cultures tend, as you probably know, to be ferociously patriarchal. And for example, in Korea, a lot of these children legally didn't exist. That is, the child standing next to you legally didn't exist because he had no father, no identifiable father. These kids were subjected not just to discrimination, but often to physical violence. And Pearl Buck, in the face of situations like that, had a habit first of writing a letter to somebody, then making a speech, publishing an essay, and then founding an organization to do something about it, often spending hundreds of thousands and I think in some cases millions of the dollars that she could simultaneously earn by writing all those books, perhaps more than she should have, but they sold tremendously well. 15 of her books were Book of the Month Club choices, and until Michener, that was a record. Michener has now had a couple more than that. I think Stephen King, if he lives long enough, will wind up with 40 or 50. But this is a woman whose books, as I said before, sold in the tens of millions in 70 or perhaps even 80 different languages. It's a remarkable career, and there are stories attached to this career. She's I think actually best. She's at her best as a writer in her own stories, and she's best approached by some of the stories in which she figures. I'm going to tell you just one. And it's a comment both on her significance once upon a time and on the kinds of turmoil she could stir up by her indefatigable commitment to doing what she thought was right. Throughout the first half of the Second World War, Pearl Buck, like virtually everybody else in the United States, supported Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of Republican China. But she was also convinced that Chiang Kai-shek was not the answer to China's problems because he was irredeemably corrupt. She didn't think the communists were the answer. because she thought that Mao Zedong was a homicidal fanatic, but she was convinced that Chiang was not the long-term answer for China. Nonetheless, she kept quiet through 1941, 1942, because she didn't want to interfere with the war effort. By mid-1943, she had decided that she wanted at least to express a modest criticism of Chiang Kai-shek in order that the American people have some information about the reality of the Kuomintang regime. And she knew she would be listened to, because it is important to recollect that she was undoubtedly the most influential popular figure in America on the subject of China and Asia more generally in those years. Knowing that she wanted to make a considerable stir with this article, she decided she needed to publish it in the largest circulation magazine in the country. That was Life magazine. But Life magazine was edited and published by Henry Luce. And Henry Luce was the most, what I said about Absalom Seidenstrecker, unreconstructed and unreconstructible orthodox supporter of Chiang Kai-shek on the planet. Henry Luce was convinced that Chiang Kai-shek could do no wrong. Luce and Pearl Buck had had a relationship, a kind of casual and edgy friendship in the 30s and 40s, and Pearl Buck sent a letter to him. I want to publish an article. It will be mildly critical of Chiang Kai-shek. I want the biggest forum I can get. I want it to be published in Life magazine. And to his credit, although the people on his staff say that when this information arrived on his desk, he went ballistic and spent a day or two having a temper tantrum. To his credit, he published the article in July of 1943. And it did have the kind of effect on American public opinion that Pearl Buck had thought it would. That is to say, it subtracted to some extent from the support that Chiang Kai-shek received. Having published the article, however, Henry Luce said to his staff, and said to Pearl Buck, I'll be in pursuit of you for the rest of our lives. You're the enemy. And in 1949, just a few years after the war, James Michener was commissioned by Life magazine to do a piece on post-war American writers, the writers who had come out of the Second World War, particularly the Asian War. James Jones, Norman Mailer, Michener himself. Michener wrote the piece, sent it into Life magazine, and got a call back from his editor, who said, Mr. Michener, it's a fine piece, we like it very much, but there's a paragraph that's going to have to come out. It's the paragraph in which you say early on, a lot of these younger male writers were in fact following in a trail that Pearl Buck had laid down a few years earlier in her good novels about Asia. And Michener said to this editor, why do I have to take that out? It's correct, isn't it? And the editor said, yes, it is, but Mr. Luce has told us all there will never be a friendly word said about Pearl Buck in any Time Life publication. And Michener, to his credit, said, thank you very much, and he pulled the piece. And the unpublished article is still sitting with the Michener papers down in Texas to this day. But it's an indication, I mean, Harry Luce being one of the most influential and important journalists in mid-20th century America, it's an indication both of the kind of effect she could have and the kind of trouble she could stir up. When she died in 1973, after all those years of writing and prize winning and honorary degrees and stirring up trouble and collecting, by the way, a 350-page FBI file that we can talk about if you like, because I'm still in pursuit of some of it. When she died in 1973, the New York Times ran 3 stories. There's a front page story on her death, an obituary. There was an inside story on her career, and there was an editorial. Her eulogists included President Nixon. She was, in other words, at the moment of her death, still, if now 80, still a considerable figure in the public imagination. By the time I was writing this book, just a couple of years ago, over the last couple of years, how do I want to put this? It's not only the case that a lot of people under the age of 40 hadn't heard of her, haven't heard of her. It is the case that some of my colleagues, to put it quite frankly, said, why are you wasting your time with that project? Well, I took the project on in part for a very personal reason, because my wife and I had adopted a child through Welcome House many years ago, although at that time I had never thought about doing a biography. And when, 4 or 5 years ago, I was in search of a project, my wife said, do a biography of Pearl Buck, and I couldn't think of a reason not to. But I said to her, I don't think this is actually going to work. I didn't know anything about Pearl Buck. I didn't know any of the things I've just told you about Pearl Buck, except maybe the Nobel Prize. And all I knew about the Nobel Prize is she didn't deserve it, right? That was obvious. because William Faulkner said so, which he did. And so did Dreiser. So did a lot of other people. And it may even be true. But anyway, I said to my wife, I will take this project on, but only until it's clear to me it isn't going to work. That is to say, I'll read some of the books, I'll do some of the research, I'll go to some of the libraries. But when it isn't going to work, that's that. And day after day, I would come back from the library saying to myself, shaking my head, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And as I began to draft the book in chapters and send it out to historians, including some very distinguished historians of 20th century America, they would write back letters to me or send emails saying, I didn't know that. How come I didn't know that? I don't have an answer to that question, although I have some speculations. But let me conclude this piece, this formal piece, this sort of pre-question and answer, which is where I want to go piece, with not so much an explanation or a comment on how a woman of such extraordinary visibility and accomplishment and sheer reputation could disappear, which is, for all practical purposes, what happened. I don't want to explain that. I want to illustrate it. And I illustrate it in the following way. If you go to the library and take out any of the many biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt, with one exception, you will not find Pearl Buck in the index. She's not mentioned. If you go to my book on Pearl Buck and look under Eleanor Roosevelt, you'll find extensive entries. If you go to the library and take out any of the several biographies of Margaret Sanger, the important birth control advocate, you will not find Pearl Buck mentioned in any of them. If you go to my book and look up Margaret Sanger in the index, you'll find an extensive series of references. Pearl Buck was an acquaintance of, and during the Second World War, I would go so far, I don't want to overstate this, as to say a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was invited to the White House and spent overnight at the White House from time to time, specifically to talk to Eleanor Roosevelt and other members of the Roosevelt administration about China. And she was a close friend of Margaret Sanger. That's documentable. So why is it that this important woman, this actually, if I may say so, world important woman, is not in these other biographies when I can trace the record of the friendship she had with these other world-class women? It's not because the other biographers were incompetent. It's because at some point a consensus seems to have been shaped, which is that you don't need to know about Pearl Buck. You're writing a long biography of Eleanor Roosevelt or Margaret Sanger, like I'm writing a long biography of Pearl. You've got to make choices. You can't put everything in. You have an A list and a B list, and Pearl Buck was on the B list. And in a way, the whole point of this project of mine is to at least suggest to people that she's worth considering for the A list. I don't make, I hope, inflated claims about the quality of her writing, and we can talk about that if you like. I do claim that she lived one of the most exciting, I mean almost melodramatically exciting, long, eventful, productive, consequential careers in the 20th century. And I also claim, for me most interestingly, that through her you can get a window on a good deal of the cultural and political debate, both in America and China in the 20th century. She provides access to a whole range of questions and issues. And so for me it's been, what shall I say, gratifying to read responses to this book. Not so much people saying nice things about me, which is terrific, or about the book, he said, with fake modesty. But I mean, they say about Pearl Buck, this is a woman worth looking at again, which is the whole point of the book in a way. So, having introduced her, therefore, in that somewhat selective, tremendously selective way, what I really would like to do is pause and say this will get more interesting if we can have some conversation and some questions and answers and comments and so on. So why don't we just do that? Go ahead. Start.
How do you account for her activism?
For her?
Her activism. What would you say motivated her?
The question, if you didn't catch it, is how do I account for the activism? I can describe it fairly, I think, elegantly. But if you listen to what I'm about to say carefully enough, you'll notice that I'm sort of going in a circle and not explaining it. That is to say, what I say is, it's almost what I said before. She inherited from her father, and to a lesser extent from her mother, the idea that she had some responsibility to save the world. But she had abandoned, she really did, quite aggressively abandoned the particular religious content of her parents' vocation. And so she became what I call an evangelist for equality, a kind of humanitarian missionary, who actually did say in a letter to her sister, I wake up at night. This is in the years of her fame, in the years of her money, in the years when she was raising money for China, working on American civil rights. She said, I wake up in the middle of the night convinced that everybody in the world is my personal responsibility. Now that's at one level arrogant, it's a figure of speech, it's hyperbole, but there was a level at which this woman, I think, both in issues like adoption, where she was in a sense trying to save the world one person at a time, and in fundraising, where she was trying to save the world in larger, million-dollar units, that she was a person who, for reasons I can't finally explain, how does one explain this, came out of a background which was evangelical and redemptive but otherworldly, and turned that sense of redemptive obligation toward her fellow human beings. And the only other thing I can add to that is that I think, and I didn't say this in this selective oral biography, I think it's really important that she grew up as a minority person in another culture. I think it's important that she felt herself to be both an insider and an outsider, actually on both sides of the Pacific. I think that's her defining characteristic in many ways. She was more deeply embedded in Chinese culture probably than almost all but a handful of other white people. A friend of mine who's the dean of the School of Foreign Studies at Nanjing University right now, contemporaneously, a Chinese scholar named Liu Haiping, says, as far as he's concerned, she's the only American writer or American he's familiar with who might be considered to be at least in part culturally Chinese, having had that deep embedding, especially in the language and literature. But at the same time, she also knew she wasn't. She was different. She was an outsider. And by the time she moved to the States, while she was American by birth and so on, she hadn't lived here for the first 40-plus years of her life, and so she always felt uncomfortable and somewhat alienated from the small talk and the customs and the ordinary rituals through which we conduct our lives. So I think somehow it's a combination of that outsiderness and that inherited sense of obligation. But that, as I confessed, is not exactly an explanation. It's a description. And I don't know how to explain it.
Okay, I have a question. I'm really concerned about this. Where did the writing come from? I mean, it seems like it just comes out of nowhere. At one point, she's a student. She's being hired psychology professor. The next thing, she's writing a Nobel Prize novel. And it's just...
Where does the writing come from? She told two different stories about where the writing came from. And I dramatized that before. There was so little writing in the first half of her life and so much in the second half of her life. The two stories she told were these. On the one hand, she would say, I always knew I was going to be a writer. I was a writer all my life. And I was just waiting for the opportunity. On the other hand, she said that it was after the diagnosis of her daughter Carol and the recognition that a lot of money was going to have to be earned to support the child, she said famously, I started then writing seriously for the best possible reason. I needed the money. I don't think that's fully I don't think either of those is fully satisfactory, but it does seem to me to be the case that she was a person who, through her writing, was also able to define herself in ways that differentiated her from her parents. Her father was a writer and a scholar, but only about theological subjects. And she was going to write about earthy subjects and commonplace subjects. And her mother wasn't a writer at all, and indeed, I think Pearl Buck waited until after her mother's death to start writing at all, because I think at some level she realized this was going to define her in a different way as a woman than her mother's way. And so I think it's in part an act of self-definition. In part there is some truth that she needed the money. And in part people who knew her when she was younger say she used to like to tell stories from early on. She was always a pretty good storyteller. So again, those aren't explanations, but they're at least responses. Yeah.
You had mentioned some feminist essays she wrote.
Yes.
Would you repeat the title? And
Yeah.
are they still in print? And can you say something about them?
No, they're not in print, although I would like to be able to report one of these days somebody's going to notice, and so on. But anyway, the volume was called Of Men and Women, and it was published in 1941. And it is a collection of essays, most of which, I'm not sure all of which, most of which had been previously published in magazines. I'll give you one example. She wrote an article for Harper's magazine in 1938 called America's Medieval Women. And the whole thesis of that article is in the title. She regarded American women as being extraordinarily comfortable, but trapped into certain kinds of almost medieval subordination. And she would say, for example, when she talked about higher education for women, American men are educated and turned out to work. American women are educated and turned out to grass. If you're not going to give them a job at the end of the education, you're going to ruin them. You would be better off, she said, having them major in things like being a hostess, running a tea party, washing clothes, how to make do, you know, with a broken piece of pottery and so forth. And her ambition was that women get educated and then find places in the world of work and in the professions if that's what they wanted. So by our 1997 measures, a lot of what she says is, one would like to believe, almost commonplace. I suspect, as one of the reviewers of my book said, using a phrase that makes me uncomfortable, but since she said it, I can quote her. She said, Pearl Buck wasn't just ahead of her time. She was often ahead of our time. And a lot of what she has to say on that volume is still kind of, at a minimum, interesting, and some of it is still, I think, relevant. Let me one last little story, anecdote. In 1962, Pearl Buck provided the cover blurb for the then unknown Betty Friedan. And if you ever see a first edition of The Feminine Mystique with the paper jacket on it, you'll see that the cover blurb comes from Pearl Buck. Because as late as 1962, when Norton wanted to get a blurb from what they regarded as one of the most prominent feminist women in America, they still turned to Pearl Buck. She was then 70. And she was already, in a sense, disappearing before our very eyes, but not altogether. Yeah.
What brought her to Philadelphia?
A couple of things, one of which is as simple as this. Her daughter Carol, the child who was impaired, was institutionalized in Vineland, New Jersey, just south of Philadelphia in New Jersey. Pearl Buck and her second husband were also maintaining an apartment in New York. She wanted a home, and she wanted it halfway between Vineland and New York. And if you take a map and, you know, a ruler and find yourself halfway between Vineland, New Jersey and New York City, you're going to be in Bucks County. It was also in the 1930s, I mean, there's a little more than that. The 1930s is the Depression, and property values are seriously depressed. And that's the decade in which writers from New York are colonizing Bucks County, as well as the Cornwalls in Connecticut and Greenwich in Connecticut and so on in Vermont. And Pearl Buck's financial career was going in a very peculiar way. Pearl Buck was getting rich. I don't mean well off, I mean rich, at the moment when the stock market had crashed and America was going headfirst into a depression. So her relative standard of living was really quite extraordinary. This is a woman who was catapulted from not only obscurity but actual poverty to world fame and wealth almost literally overnight. And so she could afford to buy a place in Bucks County, is partly what I'm saying. But it was located about where she wanted to be. Yeah.
You suggest that she was rendered inconsequential in that she was not noted in the references for the Eleanor Roosevelt, etc. Do any of her other biographers feel that she was rendered inconsequential?
There are no other biographers. Now that's an overstatement, and that's insulting to the couple of people that have attempted books on her before. But one of the things that's been so extraordinarily satisfying to me about doing this book, if you'll forgive the self-satisfaction, is that because she has been so thoroughly neglected, almost everything in my book is there for the first time. I don't just mean when I went to an archive, you know, and you get the scholar's reward of finding a letter that people haven't found in a dusty archive somewhere. That you're entitled to that. I mean when I quote essays that she published in places as obscure as the New York Times Sunday Magazine in 1935. Nobody has ever quoted them before.
What is your thesis?
Well, we're back to that same, what I sometimes regard as the 2 or 3 most important questions. It's another one for which I don't have a terrifically good explanation. I'll give you a couple of hypotheses. Okay. Thank you. I will. I want to start with this. Her writing is justifiably problematic. I've said this before. She wrote perhaps 80 books. Nobody's quite sure how many exactly she wrote, but perhaps 80 books, and a lot of them aren't much good. It's that simple. When I was doing the project, I had to talk with John Hersey before his death, himself a very fine and, in my view, undervalued writer, who had known Pearl Buck. He's also a mish kid, as they're called, a missionary child. And Hersey said, I'm so glad you're doing this project. Somebody ought to do right by Pearl Buck. But he said, don't go too far. He said, don't get too ambitious about those last 60 or so books. He said, talk about the early books. And Hersey himself identified a couple of books that he said, that specifically he talked about the biography she wrote of her two parents. She's one of the only writers ever to write separate biographies of her two parents. And what they are magnificent evocations of the missionary world. They're wonderful books. And Hersey specifically said of those two books, they still make my hair stand on end when I read them because they're so powerful. But in any case, I think it's in a way, if you write a whole bunch of books that you shouldn't write, you in a sense almost deserve it if people begin to simply make a generalization and say this is the woman that writes the bad books. So I don't pity her in a certain sense for that. On the other hand, I think the misfortune is that if you have also written a dozen or so books that are worth a second or third look, those will tend also to get erased. And so your entire career as a writer will be ignored. I think also the fact that she was a woman, both in politics and in literature, at a time when that wasn't a good thing, cannot be neglected altogether. In terms, again, of her writing, even if it were better on whatever scale it is we're inventing than it is, these mystical scales. I don't know, by the way, how everybody's always so convinced they know exactly what these scales are. Faulkner is a 8.3, and Henry James is a 6.9, and Hemingway's stock is declining, and sell your Fitzgerald and buy your Toni Morrison. I mean, I'm not sure exactly where all of these oracular pronouncements of literary quality come from, but let's just acknowledge that Pearl Buck had some problems with that. If she'd been better than she was, the 40s and 50s, which is the time when these decisions were being made about her and about university-level reading lists and the so-called canon of books, it was not a good time to be a woman. The critics were male, and they were identifying stories by men, about men, in the post-war years as important stories. There are very few exceptions to that. And so I think that's also important. I think there's a political dimension as well that I haven't exactly referred to, though I've sort of alluded to it, and that is she refused ever to, in a certain sense, network. She neither networked as a literary figure. She was living in New York in the 30s and 40s, and there were all kinds of interesting literary people living in New York. She had nothing to do with them, and they had nothing to do with her. Now you can say, well, it's because none of them wanted anything to do with her, but it's more complicated than that. It's because she didn't want to be part of that world. She had another world she was interested in, and it was the international world and the philanthropic world and the humanitarian world. I think she herself was sometimes suspicious of writing fiction because I think she thought it was just a little bit frivolous. I think she heard her father in the back of her mind till the day she died saying, how many lives have you saved today? What work have you done today? Instead of writing stories. But she also didn't endear herself politically to the right or the left. I mentioned that she refused to support Chiang enthusiastically, but she also despised Mao Zedong. It meant that she was both targeted by the China lobby and the right wing in the United States throughout the 40s and 50s, but she was persona non grata in communist China. Is to this day, by the way, at least official. This book of mine, by the way, has been published, has been translated into Chinese, and will be published in a fairly important conference this July, which I'm going to attend. And aside from, again, the sort of personal excitement of that, which I won't deny, the significance of that is that since nothing in China ever happens by accident, it's a signal that perhaps she's on the edge of rehabilitation in China, that they can publish this biography, this largely, if I may say so, largely favorable biography of Pearl Buck in 1997. So I think there was a political issue, a gender issue, and a perfectly legitimate literary question. But none of it, if I may say so, still quite explains how completely she was erased. To me, all I can do now in answer to that question is say, ask somebody else, I didn't do it, if you know what I mean. I mean, I'm the other guy. I'm the guy trying to bring it back. And again, I want to be very careful, and so I don't want to be repetitive, not because I want us all now suddenly to say, oh, there was the author of unjustly suppressed masterpieces and one of the major political figures of our time. I'm not saying that. I am saying she was much more central than anybody seems to have been willing to give her credit for, and a more interesting and eventful person than people have noticed. Yeah.
Was there a time when she was on the A list and moved to the B list, and when did that happen?
I've got a hypothesis. I don't think she was ever on the A list, but I think she was on the B+ list. And the way I tell the story, and this is, well, like everything else, I was going to say it's pure speculation. What isn't pure speculation? I think it was the Nobel Prize. I think the Nobel Prize was the worst thing that ever happened to Pearl Buck's literary reputation. Before she won the Nobel Prize in 1938, she had been publishing for 7 or 8, 9 years. She had published at that point about 10 books. They were among her better books. They had gotten terrifically good reviews all around the world. Pretty serious reviews, too. At the same time, she was regarded as a mainly popular woman's writer, and people would have probably likened her to Margaret Mitchell, who was another famous woman's writer, more successful even than Pearl Buck, more successful than anybody. She had, Pearl Buck won the Pulitzer, she'd won the Howells Medal, she'd won some serious literary prizes, she'd been admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Arts and Sciences. All of that was okay. And I think the critical establishment was prepared to say, interesting writer, talented writer, you know, not William Butler Yeats, not Eugene O'Neill, good writer. Then she won the Nobel Prize. And I think the shock of that was regarded as almost insulting by the literary establishment, to suddenly have this woman be identified not simply as an interesting or potentially B-level writer, but one of the uniquely important writers in the world. And again, she was a woman. And I don't want to harp on that, but I never want to let lose sight of that. And I think it was regarded actually as an affront, which she then spent the next 45 or 35 years paying for. She tells a story of having dinner with Sinclair Lewis. Lewis was the winner of the first American Nobel. Nobels start in 1901, okay? They don't give any American literature prizes until 1930. Sinclair Lewis gets the first American Nobel, and a lot of people say sort of the same things they would say about Pearl Buck, which is to say, wow, are you kidding? And 1936, O'Neill wins the second American Nobel Prize, and all of the, what Pearl Buck used to call the deep thinkers, are happy with that. That's good. 2 years later, she wins the Nobel Prize, bang. And I mean, there is a lot of trouble because of that. And she famously said, it's ridiculous, Dreiser should have won it. And the Australian journalist Ross Terrell told me a funny story some years ago when I was researching the book. He had known Pearl Buck years earlier. Dreiser agreed with Pearl Buck that Dreiser should have won it, and wrote Pearl Buck a very rude letter, saying, "What the hell is this? You know, and they didn't speak again. And they had been, you know, sort of in a little bit of correspondence, nothing much, but he was quite angry about it. So I think it was this if she could have continued being a moderately successful, moderately respectable, moderately productive writer, it would have been one thing. But she was suddenly catapulted into this eminence, which, by the way, she then continued to use in very political ways, I think what we would call it today. I mean, she saw that Nobel Prize as an obligation, and the money that came with it as an obligation. She threw the money and herself, you know, right into issues like raising money for the Spanish Republicans in the Civil War and raising money for medical relief in China, and so on.
She was a storyteller you mentioned. Can you tell us something more of the experience of her character, the kind of person she was in a room, what she was like?
Oh, what she was like. I not having met her, but you mean as much as I can reconstruct. I didn't miss her by much. When my wife and I approached Welcome House, it was just 1 year after she had died. So if we had been there a year earlier, we might actually have met the by then elderly Pearl Buck. My impression of her is that she was a terrifically reserved person and very hard to get to know, and I think that has a lot to do with the childhood, with this strange and in some ways isolated childhood in China, with these parents with whom she had so much difficulty, especially her father, relating, where she was, again, a person who was sort of inside the culture but also knew she was outside the culture, where she became a voracious reader and frankly lonely. I mean, she was isolated. She would sit in her room and read sometimes for days on end. I think this tendency towards self-sufficiency, if you want to call it that, but also of introversion, was exacerbated by the tragedy of Carol. And there's no question but what for years afterward she tried to conceal Carol's condition and even tried to conceal Carol's existence. And she always said it was to protect Carol's privacy, which may be at least in part true, but it was also because I think she was simply alas and tragically as people were in that generation, she treated it as stigmatic. So I think we would, that is, if I had met her and had a chance to speak with her, especially on first or second or third acquaintance, I think I would have found her reserved, aloof. I think I would have found her to be interesting in the stories that she could tell me about her travels and her experiences and the people she'd met and the causes that she had been involved in. But I don't think she would have spent much time, even if I had asked her to do so, trying to be introspective. She actually said, "I'm not introspective." Her autobiography is called My Several Worlds, and it's brilliantly titled because she's not in it. There's 400 pages of where she's been, who she's seen, the food she's eaten, the book she's read, the book she's written, the causes she has supported, politics across the world. And if you, at a certain point you notice there's somebody missing from this autobiography, and who's missing is Pearl Buck. So I think that was in part perhaps temperamental, but in part the calculated or at least deliberated response to a series of punishments or the experience of loneliness, and that she lived her life, with very few exceptions, outside the ordinary circles of intimacy that a lot of people, I think, take almost for granted. The other thing is I think she could tell a good story, so I would have enjoyed some of these occasions. I have talked to people who spent evenings, not in the family, people just who were friends of hers who spent evenings with her, and she could tell a good story. So she wasn't always fun to be with, because as she got older she became somewhat imperial as well as imperious, but she could be fun to be with.
Did she have any religious affiliation in her later years, or was she hostile to religion?
She was, in my view, what she had is what I would identify as a kind of sentimental, humanitarian, agnostic, what she said was this. In fact, let me go back a step. In 1932, she famously broke with the Presbyterians. She was the suddenly famous author of The Good Earth. A lot of the Presbyterians and other Christians were angry at her for The Good Earth, because if any of you read the book or remember it, Christianity isn't in it. There just isn't there. And Pearl Buck, of course, regarded that as a perfectly straightforward fact of Chinese life, by and large, and a couple of the missionaries beat her up about it and said, well, it should be there. And she was invited to give a talk at a big convention of Presbyterian dignitaries in New York in '32, and it became an international scandal, because what she did, this woman, was stand up there and tell all these guys that the missionary enterprise was over. And that, as she said, you could take a century of missionary exertions and it was like drawing your finger through water. She later said in the 1930s, in a letter I found very revealing, when she had begun raising money for China in the early years of the Japanese War, she wrote a very angry letter to a woman who was, in a sense, her supervisor, her first administrator for raising some of this money, and said, "It has come to my attention that you are sending my letter out, my fundraising letter, under a religious umbrella. I now withdraw the letter because I will not work with religious organizations." And late in her life, she said, and she said she was quoting Eleanor Roosevelt when she was asked about death and the hereafter, she said, "As with Eleanor Roosevelt, whatever it is, I'm sure I'll be up to it." Ma'am?
My husband and I did meet Pearl Buck in the spring of 1963 at her farm, and we had the pleasure of having her address us in the living room. And the thing that really struck me was that she had a very strong theory that children of mixed race were somehow or other very beautiful, very handsome, gifted academically, because they were the best of two worlds. She also was a very beautiful woman, older woman. She wore her hair, it was long, and she had it swept back with a comb. She was striking, and she was extremely cordial and gracious to us all.
Yeah. Let me make a comment or two about that. And by the way, as far as her personal appearance goes, on the cover of this book, we thought long and hard about the picture of Pearl Buck, because this is not the Pearl Buck that people had in mind, if they had any Pearl Buck in mind at all. This might be the one on the back of the elderly, matronly, humanitarian with the little child, and that's all true enough and very admirable. But this straight up and down vertical in her library looking at you photo is the other Pearl Buck. The mixed-race child issue is one that I have a hypothesis about. It's not only because she was spending so much of her time working for the interests of mixed-race children in Asia, but she was a good friend of David Burpee, first president of Burpee Seeds. And in the 1940s, Burpee Seeds began marketing their hybrid seeds for the first time and talking about how whether it was a tomato or a carrot, you'd get a better plant or vegetable if you bought these seeds which had the best characteristics of 2 or 3 or 4 different species. And I am absolutely convinced, though Pearl Buck never said anything about this, that she, working with David Burpee all the time, he was one of the people that gave her money for the Welcome House, that she began to adapt that vocabulary of the hybrid and of the mixture, and also believed that she was seeing some extraordinary children whose lives were being wasted by the fact that, while they were quite superior children, they were regarded as inferior and outcast children. So yes, you're absolutely right about that.
She also pointed out that many of these children born in Korea were, and that had survived, had to be physically in very good shape, because only the surviving children, the ones that survived, made it, since they were abandoned, essentially. So I think there certainly is some truth in that.
Yes, that's another comment on the religion question, by the way. One of her children's books, she wrote a lot of children's books, and as with everything else, she wrote a lot of them, and they were quite successful, and they won prizes, and they're still some of them are still in print. But she wrote one of her children's books about 4 Korean children, half Korean children, who found themselves on the streets, little boys, trying to survive, and she named them, she gave them the English names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so the religious establishment once again picks up a book by Pearl Buck, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and finds that it's a story about these 4 imperiled Korean boys. And she got a couple of angry letters about that. Well, I want to get somebody who hasn't been in.
Were any of her books translated into Chinese?
Were any of her books translated into Chinese? The Good Earth has been translated at least 8 times into Chinese. Never once an authorized translation. The family has never seen a nickel or a yuan from a Chinese translation. But yes, The Good Earth was translated probably most frequently, and I'm in correspondence right now with a group of scholars in Sichuan province who are translating several of her books into Chinese, even as we speak. So that was one of the languages into which, among the many languages into which I could add also, I want to do this in just a sentence rather than going on and on about it, but anyway, somebody has just done a doctoral dissertation at Oxford, which runs for maybe 600 pages, and it's a study of Chinese language criticism of Pearl Buck's writing in the 1930s. In other words, articles by Chinese critics appearing in Chinese magazines just in the decade of the 1930s about Pearl Buck. And it runs to hundreds of pages of stuff. He's found thousands of entries. I mean, this isn't somebody said, it's like what I said before about myself. The pleasure of doing the book is that since nobody's done it before, it's all sort of there. Well, this is the first guy with the language skills and the interest to go to China, track the archives, some of which are in bad shape, by the way, if you remember what we're talking about here. Places like Shanghai from the 30s to the 90s. The archives have been through a lot of turmoil. Nonetheless, what he found was a treasure trove of stuff, which if we were talking about, suddenly discovering 600 or 700 pages worth of articles in Chinese about James Joyce, it would be on a Time magazine cover. And I'm not suggesting it's unfair. I'm not suggesting Pearl Buck deserves that kind of attention, but I mean it's another indication, A, of how extraordinarily visible she once was, and B, of how it all just disappeared. So anyway, this dissertation has just been finished at Oxford, and it's that thick. Yeah.
You mentioned about her FBI files. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Pearl Buck's FBI file begins quite wonderfully. Actually, let me back up a step. As all of you in the room should know, J. Edgar Hoover had a particular interest in writers. And Hoover actually ran in the basement of FBI headquarters what he called the writers section. And files were kept on, you name the writer and I will say yes. I mean, in other words, any writer you have ever heard of as a file down in FBI headquarters. Files were kept on people who had been dead before the FBI was put together. I mean, there are files on Jack London. He was dead before this all started. I mean, anyway. And Pearl Buck elicited his particular attention because of her civil rights work more than anything else. So when I say she's got a 350-page file, I don't mean to say that's one of the longest of all the writer's files, although I think it is one of the longer ones. Faulkner's is 18 pages, you know, that's just nothing. Because he never did anything with it. Anyway, her file begins wonderfully with a fan letter from J. Edgar Hoover to Pearl Buck. She, in 1937, published a little short story called Ransom, which is vaguely based on the Lindbergh kidnapping. And Hoover read it and wrote her a letter saying, what a wonderful story that is. Would you like to come down to Washington? I'll give you a tour of FBI headquarters. And she never had time to do that. But that becomes item 1, page 1. And the next 349 pages are not quite that admiring. And what they consist of, as far as I can tell, and I have received 2/3 of the file so far. And I just got a letter 2 weeks ago from the guy I refer to as my agent, because we've been in this relationship for so long. In fact, he's now been promoted to chief. And I told him it's because of me and Pearl Buck that he's got this promotion to chief of the section of freedom of, what is it called? Freedom of information. Anyway, most of the stuff is the accumulated gossip and occasional press clippings that have to do specifically with her really quite extraordinary civil rights work, which I haven't even begun to touch. I just gave you sort of generalizations about it during the Second World War. She was in particular working against the segregated armed forces, and she was working against discrimination in defense industries. And she made a lot of speeches saying to Americans, you can't fight a war on behalf of democracy in Asia against people of color while running Jim Crow in the United States, because the people of color in Asia know exactly what you're doing. Over and over again, she would say that this is the equivalent of Japanese propaganda. And so that central part of her file got multiplied. Anyway, I just got a letter recently that a declassification order has come down, and I'm going to get more stuff. It's a little late, but I'm going to get more stuff in the next month. I had a funny conversation with my FBI agent about 2 years ago when Clinton did send out a declassification executive order, and I read about it in the Times, and I called my agent. I'm carefully not using his name because I want to protect sources. Anyway, I called my agent and said, I read about this declassification order. And he paused and he said, well, you're not supposed to have read that. That was classified. And it got leaked to the New York Times. I said, do you realize what you're saying? He said, yeah. I mean, he's a bright guy. You know, I like him. He said, yeah, I do. So finally, I'm going to get some more material. And I think it's going to be like the other material. Howard Fast, an actual old communist, old writer who's got a 9,000-page file, once said, when he finally saw his file, he said, if I ever wanted to prove to my children that I'd done a decent thing in my life,